Hi guys, Ben Chu of the BBC explained here in this clip about what the OBR may present in their forecast, and that the UK economy could be looking at a hole of between 30 and 50 billion pounds. But what does that mean? Well, a word that many haven't heard but many have been living is austerity. What is that? Well, the definition is difficult economic conditions created by government measures to reduce public expenditure. Ben explains that if the Chancellor goes ahead with these tax cuts, then the money will have to be found somewhere else. One option is to limit benefit rises and not link them to inflation but to wage increases, which are much lower. The other is a massive cut to public services.
Estimates suggest he would have to commit to annual spending cuts of between 30 and 50 billion pounds. That's what they would have to do to get debt falling as a share of GDP at some point. These would be cuts on a scale of those pushed through by George Osborne over the past decade of austerity. So what might the new Chancellor do? Well, one thing that has been suggested is him only raising benefits in line with wages next year rather than inflation. This would mean lower state spending, perhaps £6 billion, but...
Now, £6 billion is going to save just a drop in the bucket, really, when it comes to the massive hole that has been created by these tax cuts. And here we have once again the big problem. The tax cuts benefit the richest in society. Linking benefit increases to average wages and not inflation punishes the weakest and the most vulnerable and the poorest in society.
It would, of course, come at the expense of benefit recipients. The Resolution Foundation estimates it would cost a single adult around £400 a year by 2024, a single parent with one child around £600, and a couple with two children more than £1,000.
And here we have once again, this is the core problem here. You're handing over money to people who don't need it, and you're taking money away from people who do need it. £391 has a massive impact. That's a loss of almost £400. That has a massive impact on a single adult who is relying on benefits. And on the other end of the scale, you're giving a huge amount of money to people who literally do not need it.
Acting to make people poorer amid a cost of living crisis would be politically difficult to defend, to put it mildly. Perhaps the Chancellor will look at public services rather than benefits for cuts. Here's each government department and how much they roughly spend. Health with the most on around 190 billion, then education, defence and so on. But just look at the rough scale of those required cuts relative to departmental budgets. Most public finance experts agree that after a decade of budget cuts, there are no painless efficiencies to be found here. Plus, these departments are already getting a real-term spending cut because their cash budgets are not being revised up to take account of higher inflation since they were set.
And there we have it once again. So these departments haven't had their budgets increased in line with inflation, and now they're being expected to take a massive cut. And he's added as well here that over the last number of years, they've already had cuts. So where is the Chancellor going to get this money from?
Incidentally, to see just how much the past few days of spiking government borrowing costs has forced the Chancellor into this fiscal hole. Look at this. In March, the OBR was projecting average government debt interest payment costs of around £50 billion a year. But now, according to the Tony Blair Institute and Oxford Economics, that's doubled to more than £100 billion, more than every government department except health. So,
it must be always remembered that public services are there for the average person, but also those in the weakest in society, the most vulnerable, the disabled, the elderly, people on lower incomes. And what are the Tories going to do? They're going to gut public services. Now, the other option is to stop these tax cuts, to do a U-turn. But they won't do that. Or let me be clear, it's unlikely they'll do that because this is ideological. They have decided, and I said before, who is telling them to do this? Who is telling Kwasi Kwarteng and Liz Truss to do this? It's these right-wing think tanks. They believe in small government. They're looking at something like this saying, this is wonderful. We can reduce the size of government. When it comes to healthcare, we can offload it onto the private sector. But many people can't afford that. Well, that's their problem. We don't care. We care about privatization of the NHS, not actually protecting the NHS. Education, we care about private education, not public. Or state, I should say. These ghouls care about selling off parts of government to the private sector. And some of them are either directly getting money from these companies, or they're being offered positions when they leave their role in the government. And I include members of the cabinet in this as well. They're supposed to be there as public servants. Their role is supposed to be to serve the public, to look after the most vulnerable in society. And instead what they're doing is introducing tax cuts which benefit the richest in society and cutting vital public services. Let me know in the comment section, guys, what you think about all of this. As always, your comments are greatly appreciated. Thanks a lot.